Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Sophie Russell and I'm the chairman, and Zanny is the timekeeper. The adjudicator is Ms. Chaw. The topic of this debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Brighton Secondary School, and the negative team seated to my left is from ASMS. The speaking time for this debate is 8 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please switch off your mobile phones and other electronic devices. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Oliver Hazeldine.
Can I take off my mask?
Yeah, that's fine.
Good evening, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. We, the affirmative team, define the topic as prosecute to conduct legal proceedings against a person or organisation within court. Alleged meaning something or someone that is believed to have conducted a specified illegal act without substantial proof or evidence. War crime being an act during the conduct of a war that violates accepted international rules of the war, with a war criminal being the individual of whom conducts this act, and historic being an event of the past, specifically one that relates to a particular event or subject. We, the affirmative team, know that this statement is true. Today's first speaker, I'll be talking to you about how the prosecution achieves little substantive change, and thus we should not bother, as well as how war crime is a grey moral, and are not always cut as dry as they seem. Our second speaker will be discussing about how to prosecute would be purely a symbolic act, and how it will be a waste of time and resources. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. Tonight, I'll be discussing 2 points. Now to my first point, that the prosecution process achieves little substantive change, and thus we should not actually bother. The prosecution process of these elderly perpetrators occurs at a time that is just so late in their lives that they will not properly see their punishments enacted. Their lives have already been lived free of punishment, and due to their age, they will not actually be in prison justly for their crimes. Their age is not an excuse for them to avoid sentencing, don't get me wrong. But we must be critical of the process in which we enact their consequences. The little substantive punishment that will be enacted upon these criminals begs the question as to what this punishment achieves. The symbolic nature of these trials is a fragmented attempt to prosecute a minority group that largely went unpunished. We, the affirmative team, believe that this symbolic nature can be achieved through means that don't burden the judicial system and waste taxpayers' money, as our second speaker will illustrate later. There are a variety of cheaper and more effective alternatives that could vindicate the prosecution just as effectively, if not better, than prosecuting these poor old men, further supporting the idea that the expense and effort of the prosecution process is just not worth it. For example, combining public apologies and condemnation, media campaigns, education. This prosecution, it's not real justice. The symbolic denouncement can be achieved through means that do not cost the judicial system time, money, and resources. We must take into account the effectiveness of the process. This current push to prosecute these criminals sees no real value in the context that the negative team wishes us. There are ways to achieve this change, ways other than this prosecution. Now onwards to my second point, that war crime is a grey moral, and that they're not always as cut and dry as they may seem on the surface. This is because the average person will believe that they have a pretty general understanding as to what a war crime is, and I'm sure they do. However, I can say with certainty that there will be a lot of war crimes of which they're actually unaware of. Let me tell you about a man named Robert McNamara. Robert was the 8th United States Secretary of Defense, serving under Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, McNamara had a strong influence over President Johnson, so much so that when he was expressing doubts of winning the Vietnam War in 1966, the president allowed him to follow through with his plans. His plan is what was known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Before this, the only interference that the US had on the Vietnam War was on scouting missions. However, once this operation was permitted, the US had its first significant involvement of what we know as the Vietnam War. Operation Rolling Thunder consisted of airstrikes and bombing raids from American planes. These bombings spanned over 3 years of the war's duration, ultimately being the predecessor of the next President Nixon's massive bombing campaign in 1972. Ultimately, the moral of the story is that the Vietnam War, it may have originally consisted of minimal conflict from the US. However, the US specifically Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara resorted to air raids and bombings, escalating this war. Honestly, it begs the question as to whether he is a war criminal for coming up with the operation, or whether President Johnson is for allowing it to go through. Either way, it's still war crime. Ultimately, they've both aided in what would be classified as a war crime in any other circumstance. So why weren't they prosecuted? Now, let's focus on McNamara. Let's see what he became after leaving his position as the Secretary of Defense. He worked for 13 years as the World Bank president, making significant changes to the system with the intention of reducing poverty. McNamara did not need to have the prosecution to improve as a person. In 1969, when offered the now processed Pentagon Papers discussing the Vietnam War, he stated very angrily, "I don't want to see it. Take it back," wanting to leave his time with Vietnam behind him. He had changed as a person. Even in 1982, he urged the United States pledge to remove the use of nuclear weapons in the event of hostilities. What are now seen as war crimes were not then, so to prosecute him later in his life would not be worth it. He has already repented and improved. So what I'm trying to explain with this example is that in the past, this man did what he did, and he went unpunished. Because it wasn't actually considered to be a war crime, because they were the winners. It wasn't seen as a war crime, it was seen as him simply just doing his job. So Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we the affirmative team know that we have convinced you that we should not actually bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. Because once you open that can of worms, there are bound to be so many more problems of which you unearth. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Oscar Hazelgrave.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. We, the negative team, completely believe this statement to be false. We disagree with the definition of war crimes provided by the affirmative team. We would like to instead refer it to as the conduct of a war that violates international law. Now, the first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that war criminals should not be prosecuted for their age. This is wrong because the punishment, regardless of age, will still impact them and the society around it. They will have to sit in a cell, face punishment that is ultimately justified as they have caused mass crimes against humanity, which deserves punishment, and all victims, survivors and family deserve justice. Additionally, by prosecuting even the older war criminals, it showed that the legal system is interested in encouraging justice for all victims. Now, today, as first speaker, I will be talking to you about how not prosecuting historic war criminals will diminish faith in and henceforth effectiveness in the legal system, and that not prosecuting these war criminals will result in a lack of enforcement and therefore justice. Our second speaker will be talking to you about how bothering to prosecute brings about social change, and our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team's case. Tonight I'll be discussing 2 points. Now to my first point, that by not bothering to prosecute war criminals, faith in the law system will be lost, reducing its effectiveness. The legal system is a necessary, vitally important part of our societal structure. It enforces laws that keep our society running to the best of its ability, and it allows action to be taken against those who commit terrible acts. But most importantly, it keeps people safe. The main form of this safety comes in the body of prosecution, the act of taking someone to a court of law and having them stand trial for alleged actions. However, the safety of people cannot be ensured if prosecution does not occur. If there is no working law system, no effective punishment, no legal repercussions, then the faith in the law system will collapse, condemning the system that keeps us safe, our families safe, to uselessness. So to completely deny even the bare minimum of prosecution, no matter when the crime was committed, war criminals can commit the same horrific atrocities again and again with little to no resistance. By prosecuting these war criminals, no matter if the crimes they were said to commit were before or after ICC's limitations, I'm going to skip over that part, it creates unrest and fear. Now, this allowance is more than enough for the public to trust less and less in the legal system. It enforces unrest and causes riots for change. This situation is very similar to that of the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, where the breakdown of the legal system resulted in the death of George Floyd, and hence protests and disruption occurred. As was clearly displayed then, if faith is lost in the legal system, the structure starts to dissolve. The backbone of society is hit hard. Without the public's faith in the legal system, the law would hold no power and no one would be charged, let alone war criminals. The prosecution of war criminals, especially historic ones, is vitally important to the survival of the law system. It inspires the public and ensures their safety in the world they live in. Now, to my second point, that by not bothering to prosecute war criminals, it will result in a lack of enforcement and by bothering to prosecute war criminals, I said it right the first time. I would like to provide 2 examples to aid in my next point. The horrific violations of the international rules of law and inhumane torture that was witnessed at Unit 731 in 1935 and Abu Ghraib in 2004. Now, Unit 731 was a Japanese biological and chemical testing facility founded in 1935 to aid in the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War, which ended in 1945. During its commission, Unit 731 was responsible for the torture and death of over 10,000 civilians and prisoners of war, forcing them to take part in gruesome and inhumane experiments before sentencing them to death. Such experiments included live human vivisection, which was the operation of cutting open a live human to view its internal organs, the forced amputation of limbs, which were then reattached to the opposite side of the body, and the injection of deadly diseases such as the bubonic plague and syphilis into live subjects. Under the guise of epidemic prevention and water treatment, Unit 731 and its experiments went unnoticed for years. However, in 1945, the Allied forces were made aware of the unit and it was stormed. Overall, 12 members of the unit were prosecuted by the Soviet Union. 12 members. Working inside of Unit 731, working on torturing, brutalizing, and committing horrific acts on innocent bystanders were 3,607 suspected members. And out of those 3,607, only 12 were prosecuted. This number is outrageously low, especially when taking into consideration that almost every one of these members is known and has been identified. Arguing against the prosecution of war criminals for historic war crimes is in denying these victims' families justice, closure even. To not bother to do even the bare minimum of prosecution, we as the human race are denying justice to those who have died, and showing the world that these war crimes can be committed again, as there is no punishment or legal repercussion for the act of committing these crimes. Can we as a human race truly allow for this injustice, the open acceptance of this kind of crime to occur? Now, despite this terrible injustice, with 3,595 of Unit 731's 3,607 members running free, this was not the only occurrence. In 2004, a US prison stationed in Iraq named Abu Ghraib was found to have had multiple war crimes committed within its walls, including systematic torture, sexual abuse, and murder. According to Abu Ghraib prison records, 7,490 prisoners were located in the prison, almost all of whom were tortured or killed by the guards stationed at the prison. Again, as if history has repeated itself, out of the hundreds of guards, only 11 were prosecuted. 11! If those members of Unit 731 had been prosecuted, these criminals operating in Abu Ghraib may have understood and comprehended the risks of violating these rules of war. However, it was too late then. But it's not too late to stop the reoccurrence of war crimes now. If the remaining criminals are prosecuted, the public and other possible future criminals would witness the full power of the law system, both bringing justice to those who have died or been tortured in these horrific places, and helping to lessen future crime. So, in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, faith and justice are key elements of this debate. Who are we to deny our society the right to justice, to allow them to lose faith in the legal system? We cannot deny them this. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Nicholas Berger.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. We maintain our definition as this is in accordance with the definition defined by international law. It's an act of war that violates international rules. The first negative speaker has tried to tell you that it is necessary to serve justice, and that in not serving justice, we're not maintaining the integrity of the legal system. We agree that justice needs to serve, but what is justice? Is this late persecution justice? It's apparent that there is no real substantive, consistent justice that accounts for the crimes committed. Prosecution will never be real justice, so weigh down our judicial system and taxpayers with a case that sets a negative precedent. Why bother when we can achieve the same level of symbolic justice without prosecution? Furthermore, proper condemnation can't be achieved through prosecution due to its late nature. And prosecution does not necessarily prevent war crime because the crime is committed in the context of war. The first speaker says that this weakens the law. What's weak is in fact the prosecution itself. It serves as no real punishment and causes negative consequences, as I outlined with my points. Even if we assume that this prosecution is to occur, the first speaker doesn't recognise its inherent lack of substantive impact. Our first speaker today expertly articulated how prosecution achieves substantive change, doesn't achieve substantive change, and it is a grey moral area. Firstly, today I will be speaking about how this move is purely symbolic. Now we should look to more real substantive change rather than follow and perpetuate a dangerous precedent. I'll also illustrate how this is a misallocation of resources within an already flawed judicial system. Many of the perpetrators of these crimes are in their final years of life. People such as the now 100-year-old Schutzungen camp guard and a 96-year-old Stuffholt concentration camp secretary are facing criminal charges and sentences that will only take effect if found guilty during the short final periods of their lives. They will not serve sentences that account for their crimes, and their extent of punishments will only see a minute impact on their material conditions. This judicial process serves only as a symbolic public trial that aims to demonstrate now that we are taking action and imposing accountability. We, the affirmative team, question whether this is the appropriate course of action. We agree that the perpetrators should be found responsible for their atrocious acts, but there are better ways to seeking restitution, other than expensive and purposeless trial and incarceration that sets a dangerous precedent. The precedent set in prosecuting these war criminals is one that opens up the court process to a flood of historic crimes that achieve nothing other than provide a sense of symbolic closure or, to the extreme, vengeance. The question is, who is pursuing who? How far do we go back to go into the crimes of the past? If we argue that symbolic importance is paramount, then the heads of Britain should be punished for the crimes of what happened in India under British rule. The focus on Nazi perpetrators, as we have seen, suggests that Allies were blameless for any such atrocities. Who stood trial for the concentrations during the Boer War, or the blameless millions of died during Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not to mention Dresden and Nuremberg? When was the last time they arrested anyone for the war crimes committed in the Japanese-occupied Pacific? The list is extensive, and if we agree to persecuting criminals in the way which the negative team has suggested, then we are setting ourselves up for a vast and resource-heavy historical hunt, in order to achieve a universal sense of justice. Where is the equity if we cannot apply this justice to multiple consequences? If we as humans are committed to bringing all war criminals to justice, it is only just that we do it right and not just pick out those who the West has branded as criminals. In doing so, we open up our judicial systems to a precedent of unforeseeable amount of prosecution that only serves as symbolism rather than just punishment. However, let us not deceive ourselves in believing that prosecution is going to deter any future war criminals or effect any substantial change. This is all but a symbolic move to bring attention and closure to an issue that has long been ignored. However, to argue for and facilitate the pursuit of symbolic criminal prosecution of these perpetrators sets a precedent that leads the justice system down a path that seemingly has no end. The persecution of all those directly, or even indirectly, as we have seen, involved in these war crimes, creates a culture of weighing down our judicial systems with chasing down numerous historic cases and bringing all these cases before trial. Is this effort, this action, and this precedent worth it? No, there are many alternatives that achieve the same level of symbolic value without straining our judicial system and creating further focus on historical past happening. This point is intertwined and leads to my second point of this evening, which is a burden on our judicial system is a valid reason as to why we should not bother to prosecute historical war criminals. We only have to look at the United States to see the inefficiencies in the court process. The United States court websites reported that 97% of federal cases and 94% of state cases end via plea bargain. These are cases that don't go to trial. Nearly 80,000 people were defendants in federal case systems in 2018, but just 2% of them went to trial. Trials have been relatively rare in the federal criminal justice system for decades, and they have become even less common over time. The share of defendants who went to trial fell from 7% in 1998 to 2% just 2 decades later. A study by Antonia Parashi and Angela Zago into the judicial system found that universally increasing the volume of court proceedings would lead to a decrease in efficiency by 22 to 25%. Similarly, a study by the International Center for Criminal Law Reform and Criminal Justice Policy found that the number of court hours is not decreasing, and then the interruptions or non-stereotypical proceedings in the normal flow of cases, as we see as the negative team is arguing for, are a source of such inefficiencies. The effect of these symbolic proceedings on the judicial system, cases that have no real merit impact as the punishments of justice of the law, more than serving as demonstrations of accountability, is an effect that has a very large impact on our systems. We must consider the form of activism in prosecuting these criminals can be achieved through the means rather than criminal trial, means that do not impact and cause inefficiency in an already congested judicial system. It seems that there is more effort made to prosecute war criminals over the past 50 years in Nazi Germany than there are to stop current war criminals from occurring. The apathy of the international community and everyday citizens amongst widespread genocide in Bosnia in the early 90s was one such example. And to capture even more recent criminals who just happen to have committed their crimes against groups of people deemed less important or wielding less political power with which to push authorities to act. This is a misallocation of our resources. We're not concentrating our efforts where they should be. In other words, saving lives. It's time to move on from the terrible acts that were committed and spend the resources making the current world a better place. Evil was allowed to happen, but what good lies in prosecuting a perpetrator, a prosecution that does not serve a just punishment, that clogs our court system, that's a symbolic significance can be achieved without a trial. In conclusion, we should not bother to prosecute historical war criminals as its strain on the judicial system, the negative precedent it sets, and its purely symbolic nature that represents justice can be found through other means. And this demonstrates that the very essence of this prosecution is something that we should not bother with. We must fight against these crimes, but we must take careful consideration into the context in which we push our efforts. Thank you.
Call upon the second negative speaker, Vasil Samajia.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. We as the negative team undoubtedly believe that this statement is false. Before I move on to my substantive, I would like to rebut some points made by the opposition's argument. We would like to agree with the addition made by the second speaker to the definition and sticking with their definition. However, we believe that this goes against first speaker's second point about how there's not a lack of clarity in what should be and should not be considered a war crime. As they have stated, as well as we have stated, the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, has clear guidelines as what is considered war crimes and what is not. And for people that are, as the second speaker has mentioned, coerced or forced into doing something that is a war crime, there are lesser sentences given by and established by the ICC for those certain people, as I would establish further on in my case. The first affirmative speaker has also said that prosecuting war criminals achieves little as it punishes old individuals. However, as we will further state as well, that prosecution has other benefits, including being able to gain extra evidence and create social change, both of which important in understanding and learning from atrocious events. What alternatives does the opposition provide that is as public, as impactful as a trial watched by thousands, if not millions of people in changing people's beliefs about a certain event? The first speaker has also mentioned that war crimes are not easy to identify and people are forced to act a certain way will be punished the same way. As I've already mentioned in the definition, ICC has strict rules for what counts as war crimes, and if the person was forced to act a certain way, they will not get the same punishment as the person forcing them, but would get a lesser sentence. But not prosecuting them would send a completely wrong message, that any action could be done, and after time, it won't matter. The second speaker has mentioned that it's a purely symbolic action, and although that's partially true, the intent behind the war crimes is not just to punish. Prosecution does not equal punishment. There are many other reasons as to which the prosecution starts a case that I will elaborate on further in my points. Finally, the second speaker has provided a false dilemma that we're setting ourselves for an endless historic hunt if we keep being able to prosecute war criminals. However, bothering to prosecute war criminals does not equal to every war criminal being prosecuted at the same time. We have shown through our first speaker the effectiveness of the judicial system in being able to handle war crimes and being able to select which ones to prosecute first and which ones to prosecute later on. And we believe that the system will be able to handle that pressure. Moving on to my main focus point, that prosecution of alleged war criminals allows for evidence to be recovered and preserved, minimizing the risk of it being tampered with or lost in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to bring an individual accused of war crimes into trial in countries of the common law tradition, sufficient evidence to establish probable cause must exist. Probable causes relate to the decision to arrest or to hold a person over for trial according to the Australian Constitution. And a major issue with prosecuting historic war crimes is the lack of sufficient evidence, as most of the evidence of heinous acts gets destroyed or manipulated. In the 1980s, the Menzies Australian government concluded that as a result of very substantial gaps, as they said, in the post-Second World War immigration screening program, it was likely the significant number of Nazis or Nazi war criminal suspects were present in Australia. The Special Investigation Unit conducted 841 investigations, from which it identified 27 cases of suspected war criminal, but the charges were dropped because of lack of conclusive evidence. This shows a hurdle for enforcing international law in prosecution for historic crimes. After World War II, Australian military forces undertook investigations into Japanese war criminals between 1945 and 1951, and more than 300 war crimes trials were held in the Australian military courts, but they were dropped as well. With time, documents illustrating historical war crimes become either destroyed or can easily be manipulated to cover up the heinous acts, showing how highlighting the urgency with which we need to act to prosecute. However, the Nuremberg trials, the most famous war crime trial in history, was able to further investigate for evidence on the Holocaust and preserve it for future generations. The Nuremberg trials were a series of military tribunals held after World War II by the Allied forces under international law and the laws of war. The trials were most notable for prosecution of prominent members of the political, military, judicial, and economic leadership of Nazi Germany who planned, carried out, or otherwise participated in the Holocaust and other war crimes. The categorization of the crimes and the constitution of the court led to the creation of the International Criminal Court, and additionally, for the first time in international law, the Nuremberg indictments also mentioned genocide as a reason for prosecution, according to proceedings of the International Military Tribunal. The Nuremberg trial's most notable achievement, however, was preserving and unearthing of major evidence from the Holocaust atrocities, one that would not be able to resurface otherwise. From the start, the judges and prosecutors saw their task as more focusing on creating a record to ensure that the crimes of the Nazi regime could not be denied and would not be forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition may be arguing that bothering to prosecute alleged war criminals will be ineffective in punishing the criminal. However, although that is not true itself, as our first speaker has already mentioned, it is crucial to care more about saving the evidence about the terrible crimes for future generations. Often, trials are started with minimal evidence, and with the trials progressing, more evidence is able to be retrieved and analyzed that was not previously able to be assessed. In fact, prosecution is often initiated while there is a reasonable doubt for the guilt of the suspect in order for more evidence to be found from the event in question, according to historian Louis Bezes. An example of this is the trial of John Demjanjuk, accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a notorious guard at the Treblinka extermination camp during the Holocaust. Demjanjuk, a retired American auto worker of Ukrainian descent, has lived for 20 years in America after being accused for being Ivan during the 1970s. Before being accused of being Ivan during the 1970s. He was tried in Israel in 1988 and sentenced to death. As the initial trials were solely based on personal testimonies, the conviction was overturned. However, their initial conviction allowed the prosecution access to documents of the extermination camp that proved his identity to be that of another guard, Ivan Demjanjuk of the Sobibor camp. Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that prosecution does not necessarily lead to sentencing. However, what it often leads to is the reveal of important information which influences society's perception of events. With the initial prosecution of John Demjanjuk, the documents from the Sobibor camp were able to be found and saved. With the initial prosecution of the Nuremberg trials, the creation of the public record became possible. Therefore, we should bother to prosecute alleged criminals because that allows for evidence to be recovered and preserved, minimizing the risk of it being tampered with or lost in the future. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we're appalled that bothering to prosecute alleged criminals is a topic of debate. As we have proven using numerous examples, prosecution of war crimes, especially historic, has been beneficial, even crucial, to establishing a true and clearer picture of atrocious historical events. It has and continues to be a vital process to not only bring justice, but to ensure these atrocities are not forgotten and never happen again. So we should bother to bring justice. We should bother to ensure the evidence of the atrocities is preserved. And not bothering will mean we deem any of these as unimportant. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Finn Mann.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. And we, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. The first affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that prosecuting these criminals gives the opportunity to condemn war crimes. But no one isn't already condemning these crimes. No one is pretending that what these people did was morally right, which is why it is ineffectual for the negative team to recall all of the horrors of the Holocaust. Obviously what these people did was wrong. The debate is more nuanced than that. Or are we willing to invest the time and resources into prosecuting these geriatric war criminals? Are we willing to risk them dying mid-trial? Are we okay with the fact that due to their age, the criminals will never see the inside of a prison? Is it really worth it? Years of court time, tens of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money, all for a symbolic effort that could be just as easily achieved through other means. The first and second affirmative speakers have suggested that we should prosecute these criminals because it's just the right thing to do, and I empathise with that idea. When I heard of this topic, I thought it seemed a bit silly, really. I mean, of course we should prosecute these monsters, who were present at Auschwitz and whatnot. That is until you really pose the question, why are we prosecuting these people? What does it do? Does it provide justice for the victims of the Nazi war machine? Is it really justice if the prosecutor will never serve a sentence equal to the magnitude of their actions? Is it a quest for vindication? If so, as outlined by our second speaker, surely alternate methods exist for achieving this that don't involve dragging these 95-plus-year-olds through the court system, burdening it, wasting taxpayer money and whatnot. Especially considering that a lot of these alleged war criminals will probably die before their sentencing is completed, as has happened in a number of well-publicised cases in Germany recently. The first affirmative speaker has suggested that prosecuting these alleged criminals could deter future criminals and maintain this idea or concept of the judiciary system's power. However, let's be honest, the judiciary system has already well and truly failed on this one. As the first negative speaker actually stated, a minuscule amount of the criminals who committed war crimes in World War II were prosecuted, and fewer still were found guilty. The handling of war criminals after World War II is already an utter embarrassment, and trying to save face by desperately prosecuting 95-plus-year-old secretaries and security guards will never change that. There is no atonement for the judiciary system here. The second negative speaker has tried to tell you the system can effectively handle the timeline of the prosecution of war criminals and regular ordinary criminals. This is blatantly untrue. Due to the historical nature of the crimes, it's a race against the defendant's old age. It is a race against the clock to prosecute the historic criminals before they pass or become too sick to sit trial. Just an appropriate prosecution of many war criminals would have a large impact on the judicial system at once, costing large amounts of time and money and resources that the system doesn't currently have. The second affirmative speaker has stated that these trials will be publicly broadcasted and serve as a message for millions. However, I asked the negative team and the audience whether they had heard of these trials before this debate, because these prosecutions have been going on for years in Germany. Did you ever hear of them? Do you think the prosecutions thus far have had the massive effect that the second negative speaker suggests? The second negative speaker has suggested that prosecution could allow for the collection of additional evidence. And while this may be true, is it worth it? Seriously. I know that sounds terrible, but consider it. Prosecution is not cheap at all. You've got to pay the judge, you've got to pay the prosecutors, you've got to pay the building fees, and etc., and so on and so forth, for years and years. Considering the enormous wealth of knowledge already collected on the Holocaust and World War II, is this allocation of valuable resources worth it at the moment, especially during the time of COVID-19, with struggling global economies? Surely that money could be better spent. Our first speaker spoke to you about how prosecuting old war criminals, historical war criminals, is purely symbolic, and that more substantive change could be pursued. He also highlighted how it's a misallocation of government resources within an already flawed and struggling judicial system. Our second speaker spoke to you about how we should be focusing on promoting interconnectedness rather than reopening old wounds. He also discussed how war is a grey moral area, and war crimes are often not as cut and dry as they are portrayed. So, in conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we the negative team still unwaveringly believe that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. Listen, the Holocaust was obviously a tragedy that defies description. It, and those who perpetuated it, should be denounced, and those who were affected by it deserve vindication. No one denies this. However, the prosecution of these 95-plus-year-old alleged war criminals does not achieve this. Even if all these old alleged criminals were found guilty today, they will never serve a punishment equal to the magnitude of their crimes, and the victims will never have true justice. Now, we must commit to condemning their actions, but not in a way so ineffectual as prosecution, which burdens the judicial system, has historically failed in fairness and consistency, and sets an unsustainable precedent for future prosecution. Thank you.
call upon the third negative speaker, Ella Golding.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that we should not bother to prosecute alleged war criminals for historic war crimes. We, the negative team, believe this statement to be false. Before I begin my summary of my team's case, I'd like to address the opposition's arguments. The first speaker of the affirmative team has tried to tell you that prosecution is a waste. We are not going to tell the families of, the victims of war crimes, that prosecution is ever going to take the pain away. We aren't saying that prosecution is the perfect solution, but it gives the chance for justice. At the end of the day, prosecution is the bare minimum that we can do to provide some semblance of justice, a semblance of faith. The first speaker said that it achieves very little given the older age of its individuals. However, that prosecution has so many other benefits, including being able to gather extra evidence and create social change, as addressed by the second speaker. What alternatives does the opposition provide that is public, that is as impactful as a trial watched by thousands or millions of people globally? This punishment, regardless of age, will still impact them. They will still have to sit in a cell and face punishment that is ultimately justified. Causing mass crimes against humanity deserves punishment, and we are not willing to look families, survivors, in their eye and tell them that we are not going to give them any form of justice. Additionally, by prosecuting even older criminals, it shows that the legal system has a dedication to justice. The first speaker also told you that war crimes are hard to identify and people are forced to act a certain way. However, the ICC, International Criminal Court, has strict rules for what counts as war crimes. If the person was forced to act a certain way, they will not receive a similar punishment as a person forcing them. But what message does not prosecuting them stand? That actions could be done and that time is what really matters. The first affirmative also used the example of McNamara. However, it doesn't matter who he currently is or how he currently feels about that situation. What matters is the thousands of innocent lives he stole and the thousands of innocent people he affected. The second speaker told you that late prosecution has no benefits. However, it absolutely does. The punishment of any war criminal allows for justice, and we cannot deny that of families and victims and survivors of war crimes. Anyone who played the role in the mass murder of millions of innocent people should be prosecuted. They should face repercussions. Did they individually cause the death of 6 million individuals, if we're using the example of the Holocaust? No. And we aren't going to deny that. However, what we are saying is that these people should be held accountable for the roles they have played. Just because they didn't flip the switch, they didn't fire the gun, that does not mean that they should be completely exempt from it. The second affirmative provided you with the example of British India. However, most perpetrators from this event have passed away. Actually, I think all perpetrators have, and we aren't going to prosecute dead people because unfortunately you can't. And they also spoke about how prosecution of alleged war criminals is a purely symbolic action. Although partially true, the intent behind the war crimes is not just to punish. Prosecution allows for proper punishment to occur. It may not enforce punishment, but it does, as the first speaker said, create faith in the legal system. He also spoke about the resources required for prosecution. What resources? By your own argument, you say there are not enough war criminals to be tried. So how do they clog the legal system? In addition to this, war criminals, no matter the country they are from or the country where their crimes occurred, can be tried internationally. How are war criminals, which you have stated are low in numbers, filling up global courts of law? For example, under Division 268 of the Australian Criminal Code, Australia has universal jurisdiction over international crimes. The second affirmative also spoke to you about how there are current war crimes taking place that deserve more attention. By not focusing on the past, we are doomed to repeat it. We are dooming our future generations, as explored by our second speaker. You cannot say that the crimes by the West go unprosecuted. Abu Ghraib, an example provided by our first speaker, was a US-occupied prison. The people committed for the crimes were from the West, and they still faced equal levels of prosecution. The second speaker provided you with also a false dilemma, saying that prosecution is preventing millions of lives being saved during current war crimes. We aren't denying the importance of these issues. However, just because we are prosecuting people doesn't mean we cannot save their other people's lives. The third speaker told you that collecting extra evidence is not worth it. However, it is. COVID-19 is a challenge, but how is it not worth it to continue searching for the truth and make sure that it is not manipulated? What alternatives are the proposition providing? Where nobody trusts the system? Imagine the outrage by citizens and victims if prosecution is not important, as the affirmative team has tried to tell you. Ultimately, there is no punishment equal to the horrors of Abu Ghraib, the horrors of Unit 731, the horrors of the Holocaust. However, prosecution is the least we can do. It is the bare minimum to provide some semblance of justice. And ultimately, what matters about this symbolic movement is the sense of justice it provides. Families and survivors can watch a trial and feel as though they are finally seeing a semblance of justice. Is it going to completely save what has happened and completely change the world? No. But it is a step in the right direction. I would now like to summarize my team's case. Our first speaker spoke to you about how prosecuting these supposed war criminals provides faith in the legal system. By prosecuting war criminals, the public's faith in the legal system is enforced, allowing the law to continue to operating to its best extent. Currently, families of millions of innocent people have to sit and watch as their child's murderers, as their child's torturers walk freely. How can you expect them to feel supported by this legal system? That's right, we can't. We owe it to these families, to survivors themselves, to give them justice. By effectively using the legal system to prosecute war criminals, we are giving them some form of hope. He also spoke to you about how the process of prosecution will provide survivors with justice. Specifically, he used examples of Abu Ghraib, a prison camp where prisoners of war, innocent men, were taken. They were shot, hung, and forced to perform grotesque sexual acts upon one another. Wives and children are in their homes crying and praying for a semblance of justice. And who are we to ignore them? Men are returning home scarred, bruised, and forever reminded of the atrocities they have faced. It isn't just victims either. Families of these people deserve a semblance of justice. Mothers and fathers all having to live knowing their child has been ripped away from them. They deserve something. If we try to deny it, if we try to deny what they truly deserve, maybe we're just as bad as they are. Our second speaker he also spoke to you about Unit 731, which was an atrocity caused by Japan during World War II. Our second speaker spoke to you about how bothering to prosecute war criminals were actually leading towards social change. We need to make sure we do not make the same mistakes as the past and are working towards social change by prosecuting war criminals. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we the negative team strongly believe we should prosecute historical war criminals. I'd like to leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King. Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Thank you. I had such good business.
Right, we now come to question time. For the next 3 minutes, teams are invited to take turns to ask each other questions about the debate. That is, the affirmative team will ask a question, then the negative team, then the affirmative team, and so on. A team is free to indicate if it has no questions. I now invite the affirmative team to ask its first question.
We haven't done question time yet, is that? You can ask like a longer question, can't you?
I'm going to go to them and come back to you.
Yeah, can you do that? We haven't done this yet. Can you do that?
You guys have a question ready?
Sure, yeah.
I'll write something down.
You did mention a few times that the lack of resources, the lack of sufficient resources to prosecute everyone is a concern. Could you elaborate on the struggles that the judicial system currently has in prosecuting those criminals? Because from what we know, at least, it is currently happening in a lot of countries, namely Germany, and it is working quite effectively.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think your third negative speaker said something which I'm not entirely sure that we actually said, which is there's an enormous amount of these alleged war criminals which will come out of the woodworks when we start to prosecute them and bog down the whole justice system, which is not really what we're trying to portray. You know, you don't need a lot of cases to have a significant impact on a justice system, especially when we're talking about the kind of grand Supreme Court, which these cases have to be tried in to collect the sort of depth of historical evidence which you need. You know, you think about it, if these are, let's say, five people are prosecuted under this precedent, that's a lot, you know, five trials for 3 years, however much judge time, however much barrister time that is, however much, you know, taxpayer money that is, that's a lot. And I think the whole thing that we're trying to go by is that investment necessary? And then in terms of what I said about a resource allocation within the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, like is it worth it when there's such a, you know, so many people are being evicted and we're having these big economic struggles? It's not necessarily so much that we couldn't support these two things next to each other. It's just whether, you know, we should pose the question, should we? You know, so you might have a town that, let's say you had a town that had a local fair or something, and then in the face of COVID-19 and economic troubles, you might say, well, we won't do this year, not because we can't, but because there's better ways the money could be spent. That's more so what we were getting.
Yeah, and just to go on to that, we draw the correlations between the large amount of cases that don't go to trial and sort of the cases that do see trial. If you're saying that these are the type of cases that we do see brought to trial, we had some statistics that show the decrease in efficiency if we increase the volume. Like in any case, setting this precedent will have an increase in volume no matter what, so it will cause inefficiency. It's just what the statistics show.
And then a question for you guys. You say, I think I highlighted my points that I guess what does your team think justice is for these families? You know, you talk about justice in relation to prosecuting these criminals, and I would say that, you know, maybe this isn't, as I outlined in my speech, maybe this isn't really, you know, true justice. But I would ask you guys, when you talk of justice and you talk of, you know, finally getting justice for all these families that were affected by the Holocaust, what do you mean for that? What is justice to your team?
We believe that the main thing about justice is, in one way or another, satisfying the people that have been affected by those atrocities. Because as we've pointed out in our speeches, all three of us, the public outrage that would happen, especially from those communities that have been affected by it, is definitely not. That definitely means that we should still bother to prosecute and still to seek reparation. When we're talking about any sort of community or any sort of individual that has been disadvantaged, it is justice in this certain way would not necessarily mean punishment. As we've said, prosecution does not necessarily equal punishment, but it would mean a satisfactory, would I say, conclusion to something very, very heinous overall, and a better step moving forward. So with the prosecution, we would also look into changes and amendments in the legal system that would mean that things like that are as prevented from happening as possible in the future. So in that way, we are considering justice. We're not necessarily talking about just, as we've stated before, as an example, someone just sitting in a cell for the rest of their life for getting the death penalty. There are a lot of other things that can be brought with the punishment, and not bothering to prosecute, with prosecution, sorry, not punishment, and not bothering to prosecute would eliminate all of that.
Yeah, and also just to build on what Vasil said, there is nothing we can do that will ever make them feel fully, have full justice, because there is no form of punishment or anything that we can give out to these criminals that will ever, make up for what has occurred. There's nothing we can do that will fully make these families feel like they have got upon full justice, but it's our job to at least give them the bare minimum of being able to see, well, this person did this to me or did this to my family, and they are being held accountable for that. That's the bare minimum, ultimately.
No, that's it.
Oh, it's all done.
Yeah, that was it. That was question done. First question.
While the adjudicator finalises the result, I will read the notices. We are delighted to announce that, subject to COVID restrictions, the grand finals will be held at the House of Assembly Chamber, Parliament House, on Saturday the 25th of September 2021. There will likely be a need to RSVP for contact tracing purposes, so please keep an eye out for this information. Year 10 and Senior, would you like to be an adjudicator for primary school debates in 2022? Adjudicating is great community service and it will help to improve your own debating. See the information desk for more information about how to sign up. Topic and side information for the semi-finals will be available on the Debating SA website from tomorrow morning. Please be sure to check your side and debate time information carefully. Debates will be held here at the same venue next week. I now invite the adjudicator, Ms. Chaw, forward.
Thank you. First of all, a huge congratulations to both teams for making it this far. It was a very interesting topic tonight and both teams were really powerful, so really well done. Starting with Oliver. With your definition, most of it was covered thoroughly. Just make sure you don't leave out the phrase should not bother. That is quite a important one, especially in this debate. So just touching upon it briefly would be very beneficial. Your team split was very clear, and then moving on to your arguments, you explained thoroughly how it wouldn't cause substantial change, and that was explored really well. You did mention, the poor old men. With that one, I didn't think it was needed. It was some emotive language that wasn't beneficial in this case. Moving on to your second topic, you explained about, the war crimes and how they weren't aware of it being a significant crime at the time, so making that distinction between the context, which was very important. Your speech did fall a little short, so I thought, especially as the first affirmative speaker, this would be the time to make full use of fully preparing your speech, making sure it fits under the time limit so you can squeeze as much information as possible. Presentation, make sure you are engaging with the audience with strong eye contact, and this just links back to the fact that expectations are quite high for the first affirmative, as because there isn't any rebuttal, we do expect a very polished, prepared speech with strong audience engagement. Overall, there was good variety between your two arguments presented, so it was a great start. Well done. Opening for the negative, we've got Oscar. With your rebuttal, you provided one strong rebuttal. We want to see at least one more. So make sure you do address one more of Oliver's points. With your arguments, the main theme was the theme of justice and how we wanted to achieve this for the victims and families. You talked about how faith could be lost in the legal system. You did make a comparison between the George Floyd case, which the comparison wasn't too clear, so expanding upon that and the link would be better. With your second point, you did start out with two examples. I thought a better structure could be to provide some explanation of your point before jumping into these examples, as they were quite lengthy, so just so the audience knows exactly where you're going with the examples and so we don't miss the point. The main piece of feedback for your speech would be just to delve into these topics a little deeper. So your speech was quite surface level with the topics explored. So just making sure you're analysing those topics more as well as the further implications and just go a bit deeper overall. In saying that, you did make full use of your time, which was really good to see. Good job, Oscar. Now we've got Nicholas. With your rebuttal, I thought that you could address the opposition's points more directly. So, for example, when addressing their point about how it could weaken the legal system, you did kind of, switch the topic a little bit, using the word weaken and, kind of curving that one. So making sure you're addressing it clearly and in a structured manner. With your argument, it was a great exploration about the problem regarding, seeking retribution in this way. The main thing I noticed here was that you built up this argument really well, and in the beginning you implied that you would be presenting these better alternatives. So we, as the audience, expected that to come, but it was a smaller part of the speech. So that's something just to be aware of, because you did promise these better solutions up front and didn't deliver as strongly as I would have liked. In saying that, it was a wonderful exploration about these big problems, about costs and resources, as it is really important. You talked extensively about the inefficiencies and costs involved in prosecuting. And so the solution that you did present was, using these resources in a better way to help save lives. And that was good, but this was touched upon quite briefly in 1 or 2 sentences. So exploring those alternatives and solutions would be very important. And, later on in the debate, you would have noticed the opposition pulling you up on that about the lack of alternatives presented. So addressing that would strengthen your speech more. So this comes to the structure. I would like to present a stronger structure being that the first part of your speech being allocated to addressing these problems, so what you did, and then allocating the second part to exploring these alternatives. Presentation-wise, you were really strong. You maintained really good eye contact with me, overall really engaging. The main thing is just to work on signposting as well as referring back to that topic sentence to emphasise the relevance of the arguments made. Overall, I really appreciate the strong exploration of that problem, and you did go really in depth, so that was great to see. Well done, Nicholas. Now we've got Vasile. Starting off with rebuttal, great to see you attempt a lot of the opposition's point. One thing to keep in mind is just to slow down, especially in rebuttal, because you are bouncing from different points really quickly and the audience does need time to process those arguments. And with your argument part of your speech, the majority was about the topic of evidence. I thought this was an important one, and you did go into a lot of depth with relevant examples, talking about relevant cases in the past and where it was successful, so that was great. One area of improvement would be to highlight the importance of this, so the importance of collating this evidence, and of course you did explore the fact that it would be beneficial for future generations, but just really emphasising this point. Overall, it was a really well-structured speech, clearly a really confident speaker, so you definitely served your team well. Good job, Sil. Closing up for the affirmative team, Finn. First of all, I'd like to say that your speech was really well structured. You presented a really clean case for the audience, and we were able to follow along your arguments really clearly. It was great that you asked those important questions up front. You know, we are going deeper beyond just the surface level topics. So, you know, you wanted to break down further considerations, all the costs, not just the monetary costs. One rebuttal that you attempted was, you know, Vasile's point about evidence. With this one, you did bring up relevant points regarding costs, you know, how we already have a large wealth of knowledge and how the resources may not be worth it. While this is all really relevant, it would have been good to see you explore some other rebuttals, as this, you know, theme about resources and costs was, you know, quite prevalent throughout your speech. So just a bit more variety in responses would be more beneficial. I thought you did address the majority of opposition's points, which was great, and you did so in a really eloquent manner. You spoke with clarity, very well paced, and presentation-wise, I thought your presentation manner was extremely effective. It was great that you kept your summary short, and it really closed off your team's case strongly. Great job, Finn. And now we've got Ella. You spent a great amount of time on rebuttal, explored a lot of the opposition's points. Great job. Great that you asked a question about what alternatives there are to address those important considerations like justice. At first, I would have liked you to emphasise this more, but you did later on in the speech. You raised this question again, which was great. With the point about resources from the opposition, with this one, you did call out some of their contradictions, but then you didn't go on to, you know, attack their point. So with that one, while it's great to call out those contradictions, definitely go that step further and address their point regardless. So that's something to work on. Overall, there were great points of rebuttal, and all these points were really amplified with your strong presentation skills, being really engaging, maintaining eye contact with the audience for the majority of your speech. That is a really important part. You met the time limit, made full use of the time, keeping that conclusion really short, which was short but was sufficient, so that's what we want. Overall, you were really powerful and definitely closed off your team's case strongly. Well done. This was an extremely tough decision because both teams did have their strengths. So the stronger case overall for tonight is the negative team. And the Speaker Award goes to Finn tonight. Well done. Thank you.
I call upon a member of the runner-up team to give a vote of thanks.
That's over. Thanks to everyone for coming out. It was a lot of fun. It was a really good debate. End up all these years of debating. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the the chairman and the timekeeper for doing all your things tonight, and the adjudicator for such great feedback, and thank you to the audience for coming out, and the negative team for such a great debate. Good job, you guys deserve it tonight.
I call upon a member of the winning team to second that vote of thanks.
First of all, I'd like to thank the adjudicator for an awesome feedback. There's definitely a lot of pointers that we can work on, so thanks a lot for that. Thanks to the audience for an awesome job, looking at us. It's definitely better than to, debating in front of people than just the camera. So thanks a lot for that. Thanks a lot to my team for a great job. Thanks a lot for my previous team for an awesome job. It was a really tough debate, as expected. So looking forward to see you guys soon. Thanks to, Chairman, Timekeeper, doing an awesome job, and hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance. I now declare this debate closed.
Fabulous.